Welcome to the latest passive solar greenhouse video from Mid Wales in the UK.
Hard to believe, but 2024 was our third growing season in our passive solar greenhouse, which we built in 2021 to replace an ancient polytunnel.
Over the previous two growing seasons, the greenhouse had performed exceptionally well, growing multiple fruit and vegetable crops, annual and perennial, throughout the year, and providing us with an abundance of fresh produce for our kitchen.
The indoor temperature has only very rarely dropped below freezing, even though we live in a notorious frost pocket here in the steep-sided and narrow Upper Severn Valley in Mid Wales.
This video captures what happened in our third season growing in our greenhouse, which was last year, 2024. It shows what did well, what didn't, and the conditions throughout the year, along with our monthly harvests and temperature ranges.
The season had a distinctly different feel to it, as according to the UK Met Office, it was the coolest summer since 2015. Weather experts put this down to northerly winds in June and July.
The lack of sunshine definitely had an impact on some of our crops this year, even though they were growing in the shelter of the greenhouse. Others, though, did better than normal, such as gardening life with or without a greenhouse.
2024 also became known as the Year of the Mouse. More on that later.
First of all, let's look at some of the jobs that we did before the start of the new growing season.
Instead of buying in well-rotted manure, this year we used homegrown garden compost to top up the beds.
The windows were cleaned, the beds tidied, and a seed sowing plan emerged.
Outside, we made a new path from the greenhouse up to our veggie terrace in January, making it safe to move up and down our hilly garden. We crushed rock collected from elsewhere on our patch and laid it into the muddy bank.
And so to the 2024 growing season in the greenhouse. Here, briefly, is what happened month by month. January.
The new year started with a battering on 2nd of January from Storm Henk, the 8th named storm of the 23-24 season, which runs from early September to late August each year.
There was serious flooding across swathes of North Powys, the county in Mid Wales where we live, but we survived unscathed.
On 17th of January, the temperature dropped to -9 degrees centigrade outside overnight, but didn't drop below freezing inside the greenhouse, and was actually 20 degrees centigrade by early afternoon due to sunny conditions.
By the following Sunday, Storm Isha had arrived with milder, wet and windy weather, and 2 days later, Storm Jocelyn. Such is the British temperate climate, it can swing rapidly from one extreme to the other, depending on where the jet stream is blowing across the Atlantic.
We added some additional wires along the back wall for further training of the peach tree, which was establishing well on the back wall.
Towards the end of the month, we sowed several lettuce varieties in small cell seed trays to try and get the growing season off to an early start.
The lowest temperature for the month was 0 degrees centigrade and the highest 23 degrees centigrade.
February.
The seed sowing continued in earnest in early February. Mizuna, pak choy and lettuce varieties, including speckled trout, winter density, little gem and Tuscan pesciatina, were all sown.
Sweet pea and marigold seeds also. We used handy plastic covers over the modules to boost the heat and keep hungry mice at bay.
By mid-February, the peach tree was already blooming with its delicate pretty pink flowers, far more than the previous year. With very few pollinators around at this time of year, particularly in the greenhouse, it was time for us gardeners to take matters into our own hands.
Dreaming of sweet, juicy peaches later in the season, we used a small artist's brush to try and pollinate the flowers by hand.
The tricky thing was finding exactly the right moment to transfer pollen from the stamen of one flower to the stigma of another, and then the waiting game started.
The lettuce seedlings were now popping up in the seed trays. Towards the end of the month, they were planted out in the greenhouse beds.
Potatoes, red mustard, parsley and nasturtiums were all coming back strongly in the beds after a quiet winter. Newly sown rocket, radish and parsley had also germinated.
The lowest temperature for the month was 5 degrees centigrade and the highest 26 degrees centigrade.
March. In early March we were away for a week, and whilst gone the mice came out to play. The lettuce seedlings planted the previous month were devoured in our absence, giving the first hint of the mouse invasion which was to plague us for much of the season.
So fresh seed sowing was top of the agenda for March. Along with lettuce attempt 2, we sowed climbing French bean, marrow, radicchio, landcress and basil, plus leek, sweet corn, sunflower, kale and cabbage varieties, ultimately destined for the outdoors.
In our house propagator, tomatoes, cucumber, squashes and courgettes were started off. The newly germinated propagator seedlings were potted up into small pots to grow on along the window ledges.
New seedlings in the beds were coming along well by this stage. The grapevine was shooting and the asparagus, and tiny young figs appeared on the fig tree.
The irrigation system was reinstated on 30th of March.
On March 31st, mice ate sowings of sweet corn and sunflowers from the greenhouse bench. They also grazed all our lovely new lettuce seedlings. Time to dig out our humane mouse trap.
According to the Royal Horticultural Society's website, mice can produce up to 5 litters of 4 to 6 young during the breeding season, which is from spring to autumn.
The lowest temperature for the month was 4 degrees centigrade and the highest 34 degrees centigrade.
In March we harvested parsley, red mustard, fennel, nasturtium leaves and radishes.
April.
We caught our first mouse on 3rd of April and the second on 5th of April. Humane traps are not as humane as we might hope, sadly, as once relocated, mice often struggle to find food in a new territory.
However, we are reluctant to put snap traps in the greenhouse, as birds and frogs both frequent this space too.
Another mouse was spotted lurking beneath the bench on 14th of April, but we never managed to catch any more at this time. We did, though, work out where the mice were coming into the greenhouse by using our trail cam to spy on the intruders. Aha!
So they had found a small gap between the rear door and the door frame, chewed away some of the wood and snuck inside. We quickly blocked up this route, but once our greenhouse doors were open regularly due to higher temperatures, the mice would be free to come and go as they pleased.
Crops were starting to grow strongly by now, including radishes, pak choi, climbing French beans, mizuna and freshly sown lettuces.
Once transplanted, the baby lettuces were covered with plastic bottle cloches to keep the mice from snacking.
Healthy young marrow plants were transferred to the beds to grow on.
Bench seedlings, including those grown indoors, were also thriving, though still nibbled occasionally. The greenhouse was also a temporary home for some new pelargoniums we bought for our patio pots.
Our first ever peaches appeared on the tree, which was very exciting.
Late in the month, we cleaned the polycarbonate glazed roof as algae had taken hold over the winter. We used a long-handled scraper covered in fleece with hot soapy water.
Mid-April saw a hard frost outdoors, but indoors stayed a toasty 7.4 degrees centigrade, the lowest temperature for the month. The highest temperature was 34 degrees centigrade.
In April, we harvested pak choi, parsley, radishes, rocket, kale, red mustard, nasturtium leaves and mizuna. We also harvested 5 pounds of new potatoes on the 27th of April.
May is traditionally a very busy month in the greenhouse, with many young plants being placed in their final growing positions, ready for the season ahead. These included tomatoes, cucumbers and squashes, as well as salad crops like lettuce.
Other later fruiting crops are sown for raising and planting outdoors, such as runner beans.
Plants soon start to shoot upwards, with lush, fresh green growth as the temperature begins to heat up in the greenhouse. In a few weeks they will have doubled, tripled or even quadrupled in size.
Here are some of our favourite lettuce varieties.
Just one peach has continued to swell over this month, but one is better than none.
And our grapevine started flowering across the whole back wall section to which it had spread the previous year.
The bench is still packed with young bedding plants and also spare tomato and squash plants. Later in the month, the outdoor plants spend their days outdoors hardening off on our pallet table.
The greenhouse is full of colour as flowers begin to bloom generally, including a bench pelargonium and amaryllis, passion flowers, nasturtiums, French marigolds and some kale going to seed rather prettily.
The lowest temperature for the month was 10 degrees centigrade and the highest 35 degrees centigrade.
In May we harvested pak choi, kale, lettuce, radish, bay leaves, parsley, fennel, giant red mustard, nasturtium flowers and leaves and mizuna. June.
By June it was noticeable that greenhouse plants were not as well progressed as previous seasons, probably due to the start of what turned out to be a very cool and dull summer. Many diary entries for the month note that it was frequently wet and cool, with showers and mainly cloudy.
Crops, such as courgettes and squashes, had started to fruit, but they never really grew that big or produced as prolifically as before. Tomato flowers also began to bloom.
Salad and other green leaves such as parsley, mizuna, kale, rocket, landcress and nasturtium loved the relatively cool environment of the 2024 summer greenhouse, however, and we ate freshly picked delicious salads day in, day out.
The figs at this stage were looking quite promising. The many bunches of flame grapes were swelling nicely, and the beloved peach was bigger every day.
Unfortunately, another mouse was spotted, but not caught, in the greenhouse on June the 21st. We really hoped it didn't have a taste for juicy peaches.
Late on in the month, the greenhouse had a new coat of preservative externally, 3 years after the first application following construction in 2021.
The lowest temperature for the month was 7 degrees centigrade and the highest was 35 degrees centigrade.
In June, we harvested radishes, kale, coriander, various lettuce varieties, nasturtium leaves and flowers, climbing French beans, parsley, mizuna and fennel.
July. The weather continued to be damp and cool, with occasional sunny intervals for much of July, until the last week anyway.
All the plants looked healthy. Tomatoes, cucumbers, courgettes and squashes such as Turk's turban just slow growing and fruiting poorly compared to previous years, with the exception of the marrows.
Climbing French bean Necker Gold did well though, and the salads just kept on coming. The grapes were also starting to ripen.
Giant leaves of squashes and vines started to spread, threading their way along beams and through other plants such as the bay tree.
We left some radishes to go to seed with their pretty lilac flowers. Outside, the wildflowers were thriving in the cool summer and the rowan trees were already bursting with berries.
We planted more young squash plants in any gaps we could find in the beds, whilst others were grown on outdoors in the hope of a crop.
A huge hornet and a green-veined butterfly were spotted in the greenhouse this month.
The lowest temperature was 12 degrees centigrade and the highest was 36 degrees centigrade. We used the window extenders for the first time this season on 31st of July during a rare hot and sunny week this summer.
We harvested the first 2 figs of the season on 22nd of July. Other harvested crops included climbing French beans, many lettuce varieties, mizuna, courgettes, bay leaves, parsley, landcress, basil, nasturtium leaves and flowers.
And not forgetting our first ever peach, which we picked and ate on 4th of July. It was so tasty and sweet, delicious. August.
The hot weather of late July soon reverted to the cool and wet conditions we had become used to this year. Surprise, surprise.
Butternut squash fruits started to swell, which was reassuring, and tomatoes slowly began ripening. The grapes were surpassing all expectations, with many, many bunches all slowly ripening now.
Our first cucumbers hung high from the beams, and we found one large pumpkin beneath the undergrowth, plumping up well.
Chicory sugarloaf was growing well, although newly planted lettuces had once again succumbed to an overnight hungry visitor, probably the mice. And indeed, on August 3rd, another mouse was caught.
Basil, always slow growing for us, was reaching its peak and remained unnibbled.
The fig tally on the blackboard showed 11 fruits by this point in the season.
Storm Lillian, the 12th named storm of the season in the UK, hit us on the 23rd of August, just at the start of the summer bank holiday weekend. It brought high winds, heavy rain and even power cuts for some of our local friends.
In August, we harvested our third marrow of the season, which weighed a whopping 3,093 grams, along with climbing French beans, lettuce, chicory, the first tomatoes, courgettes, cucumbers, some mini Turk's turban squash, basil, bay leaves, parsley, landcress, mizuna, nasturtium leaves and flowers, figs and grapes.
The lowest temperature for the month was 10 degrees centigrade and the highest was 34 degrees centigrade. September.
We were away in early September and left the greenhouse to its own devices. Upon our return, we finally found more tomatoes had ripened. Yay!
The area round about was starting to look distinctly autumnal, with a few yellowing leaves, loads of rowan berries and a late display of gorgeous sunflowers.
Inside, the grapevine was going over. but there was plenty of late season produce to gather and enjoy. Cucumbers were thriving and butternut squash growing fast.
A few tomatoes had been pecked by birds. Perhaps the greenhouse worms are just too big to cope with.
By late September, the rain was fairly relentless, giving us longer to enjoy our greenhouse gardening. Looking closer, we realised that radicchio flowers are a pretty blue colour, which we never knew before.
The lowest temperature for the month was 3 degrees centigrade and the highest was 33 degrees centigrade.
In September, we harvested French climbing beans, cucumbers, tomatoes, lettuce, basil, pumpkin, butternut squash, parsley and landcress, and the occasional fig. October
and the giant, almost tropical-looking squash leaves were fading fast. There were still crops to pick though, tomatoes, salad leaves and cucumbers being top of the list.
So we kept on picking, but also started tidying up where veggie plants had gone over completely. Some of the tomatoes did rot off in the damp conditions.
The first frost of the season was on October the 11th and the first named storm, Storm Ashley, on the 20th. As usual, the autumn weather yo-yoed between wet and mild and cold with sunny intervals.
When the rain stopped for a brief while, the autumnal Upper Severn Valley countryside looked absolutely gorgeous.
The lowest temperature for the month was 6 degrees centigrade and the highest was 32 degrees centigrade.
In October, we harvested radicchio, chicory, parsley, butternut squash, tomatoes, cucumbers, nasturtium and bay leaves, and nasturtium seeds.
Early November was quite mild. Inside the greenhouse, marigolds bloomed on and on. Butternut squashes started to turn a buttery gold. A few figs even plumped up and ripened. Passionflower was still blooming, even outdoors.
Mice popped back to munch on a few new potatoes, but otherwise plants began to fade and decay, just as usual for late autumn. Then frost arrived with a beautiful sunny morning. After all the rain, it was wonderful.
The manifold for the greenhouse irrigation was dismantled in the middle of the month, just before a week of heavy wet snow in mid-Wales. Our valley, and indeed much of the country, is transformed overnight into a winter wonderland. It was the snowiest November since 2010.
The snow was so heavy it crushed our cabbage cage, so we decided to remove several inches of snow from the greenhouse roof as a precaution. This is the first time we've had to do this.
A few days later, Storm Bert blew in off the Atlantic, and with the weight of snow followed by heavy winds, several trees blew down. Luckily, none fell on the greenhouse.
The lowest temperature for the month was 1 degree centigrade and the highest was 28 degrees centigrade.
In November, we harvested butternut squash, tomatoes, cucumbers, figs, chicory and parsley.
December.
Storm Connell in late November pretty much passed us by, blowing further south, but Storm Dara hit with a vengeance on the 7th of December, taking out our power for 34 hours and closing many local roads due to fallen trees and electric cables.
Again, the greenhouse stood up well to the storm, testimony to the strength of the high-quality build.
Once the gales had subsided, it was finally time to clear away the decaying plants of squashes, tomatoes and climbing French beans. These were barrowed away to add to our compost bin.
The greenhouse always looks very bare at this point, but it's quite satisfying clearing away the old to make way for the new.
The peach tree and vine were once again revealed in all their skeleton glory. It was time to tie in new branches and tidy away fallen leaves.
The lowest temperature for the month was 4 degrees centigrade and the highest was 21 degrees centigrade.
We harvested a few new potatoes, the last of the tomatoes, parsley, bay leaves, a small amount of lettuce, chicory and baby nasturtium leaves.
Let's look at some of the challenges in year 3.
All in all, it was interesting to observe how the greenhouse performed in a below-par year due to poor weather.
Some crops clearly benefited, mainly salads, as they continued to crop week in, week out without the stress of high temperatures. Others, though, which flourish in the heat, suffered massively, including tomatoes, figs, cucumbers and squashes.
The harvest of these crops were way down compared to the previous 2 seasons.
Looking back on performance, we focused on the key challenges faced in 2024 which were the hungry mice and the cool summer, the year of the mouse.
A mouse is the chief suspect for eating through an aubergine plant in June. Many other garden crimes are stacked up against these mice. We've tried putting onion peelings down to deter them, but new approaches may be required. The battle is still ongoing.
We're encouraged to read that mice populations ebb and flow and look forward to less in future. One thing is for sure, our resident tawny owls certainly aren't going hungry with the abundance of small well-fed rodents in our garden.
Let's take a quick look at other wildlife, also known as pests, in our greenhouse this season.
Whitefly was spotted as we harvested our potato plants in April. We quickly disposed of the foliage once discovered. More aphids were found on our fennel plant in July, so we pruned this down to the ground and disposed of the prunings well away.
Bay sucker, a sap-eating bug, has infested our bay tree. It is active from May to October, causing the new leaf shoots to discolour and distort. The curled yellow leaves look horrible, so we usually prune them off and otherwise tolerate this bug as it doesn't affect other plants.
Our frog appeared in April again. We're not sure if it's the winter resident or a newcomer, but it's very welcome, especially for slug removal purposes.
And so on to the disappointing summer weather of 2024.
Our lovely young melon, hero of locking, never came to anything sadly due to cool weather this summer.
The aubergines also failed spectacularly. Many other crops were severely reduced. Cool weather also had a drastic impact on the number of pollinators. Many tomato vines only had a couple of fruit as the rest of the flowers remained unpollinated.
The fig harvest was very disappointing this year, with just a total of 15 recorded. Again, this was probably due to the lack of summer heat.
However, the weather is what it is, clearly completely out of our control. Winter storms and summer heat waves, we have to take them all in our stride.
We celebrate this year's salad crops and look forward to future years, never actually knowing which will be our bumper crops and which may struggle to flourish.
Each year is different in the garden, but so long as our greenhouse continues to provide tasty food and a beautiful place for the resident gardeners to grow it, we are happy.
This year, 2025, we look forward to experimenting with some different varieties in our greenhouse, including heritage tomato varieties such as lemon gazi, or is it gazy, buffalo horn and giant tree tomato. We hope you'll join us here to find out more. Thanks for watching and happy greenhouse gardening all!